I was really a human rights activist, really. But then I read a book, and he introduced the notion of speciesism, and that is animals have rights. And I just thought, well, actually, if I'm against all these, if I'm actively into social justice issues and anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc., why the hell am I not? Why the hell am I a speciesist? Why am I exploiting animals who have rights? I'm often amazed how animal rights is not taken more seriously. Why is everyone so utterly disgusted by the dog meat trade while might be eating chickens, for example? If you're listening to this and thinking, oh, that dog meat trade is horrible, how can you do that? That's my pet. Then please don't, eat a pork chop, because pigs are just as sentient and just as intelligent as dogs. Showing shocking images isn't enough. If you see a shocking image of an animal, you might turn away. It's also a tool for social change. We have rainbow colours at the side, and we kind of show that we're an inclusive team. And even though that is a very social thing, it's also a political thing, for me certainly anyway, because that's how you change society. You don't have to do things with a hammer, and just play football.
Welcome, Gemunu. Thank you so much for being here. I invited you because I saw an incredible speech that you were giving yesterday at an animal rights conference, and it was really inspiring to hear about your background, your work as the founder of TRACS and the leader of TRACS, an animal investigative agency. So I was wondering a bit if you could start by telling a bit about what do you do in an animal investigative agency?
I've set up TRACS investigations 18 years ago, in 2006, and the purpose of it was really to help animal groups investigate animal issues, because at that time not many people were showing the reality of what was going on in a factory farm or an animal laboratory or in a circus, etc. So it's really to provide visual evidence for groups that could campaign and lobby on, and to campaign for a better world for animals.
And how did you get into this path?
Yeah, well, it's my background is a filmmaker, but my background was also into social justice issues. So I first started investigating 36 years ago. That was my first experience on the factory farm. And the reason I got into filmmaking is I kind of used it as there's probably not a great term, but a propaganda tool, a tool to actually educate people, because I feel there's a real power of the image. And I've always been an activist, so my background wasn't an animal rights activist. I was really into social justice issues. I was brought up in Sri Lanka, and I lived my early life in Sri Lanka, and then came to the United Kingdom. And in the 80s, the United Kingdom was quite an oppressive place, really, because it was, we had quite a right-wing government, but on the backside of that, there was a real oppositional culture to what was going on. There was an oppositional culture to the fear of war. I mean, these were the big days of C&D when you actually thought you can have a nuclear war. And the government at that time was also actively supporting the apartheid system in South Africa. So I was involved with the anti-apartheid movement in the UK, and also got involved with just other social justice issues. My first job, for example, was as a welfare rights worker, which was helping people on unemployment benefit, and campaigning for them to say, okay, their situation, their payments are getting cut, and so I was really a human rights activist, really. But then I read a book, and it was quite a transformative book. It was by Peter Singer, and it was a book called Animal Liberation. And he introduced the notion of speciesism, and that is, animals have rights, just like, and to deny them rights is an affront. And he equated it really with racism and sexism, and I just kind of made the link then. I just thought, well, actually, if I'm against all these, if I'm actively social justice issues, into social justice issues and anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc., why the hell am I not? Why the hell am I a speciesist? You know, why am I exploiting animals who have rights? So it was like a bit of a sea change, really. It was just coming out from, yeah, it came out from social justice issues to an animal rights issue. So I got involved with animal rights. So I was still, when I first started investigating or filmmaking, you know, I was still doing welfare rights, but then I got into using filmmaking to start investigating animal rights.
And what do you do typically as an animal investigator? Because I think most of us, we have a connection with the word investigator with all these crime series on television, etc. How is that similar and how is that different to your work as an animal rights investigator?
Well, kind of our focus of our work is really to show how we use animals, you know, like the hidden lives of animals. So that's the investigative part, it's showing the hidden lives of everyday animals, you know, the animals that we use for food, fashion, entertainment, companionship, and animal experimentation. You know, sometimes what we generally see of animals is wildlife documentaries on television, but you hardly ever see the real realities of what goes behind the doors of a factory farm, or what goes behind the doors of an animal laboratory. So my job is really just to educate, or no, it's actually to provide visual material of what's going on. So that's the kind of investigative angle, is to show the hidden lives.
And in your experience with 4 decades doing this work, how does this impact people when people see this material? How efficient is it as a tool?
I think, I mean, part of my talk at the conference yesterday was just interestingly saying is showing shocking images isn't enough, you know, because if you see a shocking image of an animal, you might turn away. So I like to work with organisations which can have a political tool or legislation or a campaigning tool or a marketing tool to actually not just show people what happened, but show them perhaps there's a different path. So sometimes I work with welfare organisations talking about the conditions of animals and how potentially they could be improved by just doing a few simple measures.
Just based off of a few of the images that you showed yesterday, and you said these were some of the milder ones that you've seen quite a lot of horrendous conditions over these 40 years. What have been the hardest parts of the job, and also what have been kind of the light spots or the best parts?
I think the hardest part is when you keep doing investigations and nothing happens.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I've been investigating the primate trade, for example, and the international trade of primates for animal research. And this is when monkeys are kind of really torn from the wild, you know, literally captured. And for one investigation, I went on with a monkey trapping gang to actually witness this firsthand and document it. And then they are often put into what's called primate breeding farms, which is, it's like a factory farm for primates. And these are all across Southeast Asia, like places like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, but also in Africa and Mauritius, where they basically, it's a factory farm for primates. Remember, primates are, you know, monkeys are wild animals. You know, they're used to forest, they live in social animals, they live in family groups, and here they're kept in either small pens or individual cages, and then destined to be sent overseas, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles, to animal laboratories in UK, Europe, China, where they'll be tested for mostly what's called toxicology tests, so tests for products, etc. So it's not generally for the major animal research type, it's not major for medicine, for example. And we've been investigating, or I've been personally investigating this issue for 20 years, and I've seen very little change. So that's been really disappointment. You know, I've seen it's really been hard to get public engagement on it, because for some reason you might get a couple of newspaper articles, but no real public engagement, and certainly not any legislative engagement, and certainly no corporate engagement, because that's part of the reason for investigations really, is to, first of all, get the public to act. And secondly, if the public has enough outrage, generally they will put pressure on legislators to change legislation. Or some of the investigations are to put pressure on companies, because the public outrage will say to the companies, we don't want to be associated with that, we want to change our policies. So that's been kind of the hardest thing when, you've been doing something on and off for 20 years and you've seen no change. So that's kind of the disheartening aspect of it. But on the flip side, I've seen real positive change, and that's what keeps me going doing investigations. I mean, one example of that is how we've actually changed legislation on a number of farm animal welfare issues. One is the live exports of animals, which I've been investigating, certainly from the UK and Australia. And in the UK, I've been investigating this issue for, I think, since 1998. So what are we talking, 36 years? Gosh, yes, 36 years ago. So, and literally showing the conditions that animals endure on long distance animal transport. There's kind of a hidden aspect of animal farming. You think of animals on the farm, you think of animals on slaughter, but what you don't think is what happens in between. Animals get into the slaughterhouses, and you probably would imagine it's quite a short journey, but the reality is somewhat completely different. Animals are transported all around the world just to be killed at the point at the slaughterhouse. So, for example, in the UK, I've trailed animal transport lorries from the UK to France, Spain, Italy, Greece, and these are journeys of over thousands of miles. And if you think about, your daily commutes, if you're packed on the truck, etc., you've got no water, and these animals have no water, no food, and they have to deal with, the outside conditions. We were on one investigation that we did in Italy, where there was about 60 animals died on the truck, as to do with the conditions, and our investigators got involved and helped take the animals out. But going back to your point of the joys, I think of the successes, is that after 20, 30 years, earlier this year, the UK government announced a ban on the live exports of animals. So it was due to the constant pressure of investigations, due to the constant pressure of lobbying by the organisations that we work with.
And because some of the things, I was wondering, the different tasks that you are given, the different projects you work on, are they usually tasked with showing kind of cruelty that is also illegal, or just the conditions within the legal treatment of animals within a judicial system that is everything but humane?
That's a really good question, and the majority of it, in fact, virtually all of it, is to show the reality of animals, and it's usually legal. We're not trying to show the illegality of the trade, because we were just trying to show you the legal trade is, that how animals are kept on farms are inhumane, but these are legal. These are the standards that the government has accepted. So the purpose of the investigations is to change those standards. It's to actually say, this isn't acceptable, you need to take these animals out of cages and keep them in a different system, for example. That's a step-by-step process. Ideally, as an animal rights activist, I would like to see no one eating meat, but I also realise that that's not going to happen overnight. And I'm a pragmatist, so I believe the best thing for animals at the moment is to get them out of cages on the first instance, and then see where we go from there.
I wanted to go a bit back to your points. You were talking about some campaigns that were efficient, that changed people's opinions and changed the actual laws, and other campaigns that didn't. And we actually met during another talk that we were listening to together here by Melanie Joy, the author of a book called Why We Love Animals, We Eat Pigs, We Wear Cows. Which is a very interesting question. Why are there some animals that we treat often as family and other animals that we eat and we treat them in the worst of conditions? It's often, at least in my perception, it often comes back to maybe the cultural way how we see the animal, but also how we see ourselves in the animal, which is so often the cuter the animal or the more similar to human or the more capable they are of showing emotions that we can relate to or behaviors that we can relate to, then the more likely we are as humans to treat them better or to be more susceptible to campaigns. And that's what surprised me a bit with your example from the primate industry, which are some of the most similar species to us that we can often relate to much more than we can with other species that look and behave more differently. So how has this been within your experience? What kind of catches public attention? What gets to people's heart and what doesn't?
That's a really good question. You're very right. We thought the private trade would be much more public, the public would get much more engaged with it. But I think one of the reasons that didn't change was having the industry push back. And I think without getting too conspiratorial about it, you are facing a.
Oh, that's okay. We'll take a break. So we had a small interruption because you just received a phone call, and I wanted to include it in the interview because it adds to this James Bond part of the. So yeah, I felt like I was really in the middle of the action almost. Yeah.
Yes, I mean we have investigators out. We've had at the moment we've got 2 teams of investigators out. In Asia and also in Europe. That one was particularly in Asia, and it's very interesting. Following up from your initial question, is what makes they're investigating the dog meat trade, and whilst in the UK and in Europe, people are horrified by the dog meat trade, and this goes back to your question of some animals you have affinity with and some animals you don't have an affinity with, and why is everyone so utterly disgusted by the dog meat trade, whilst they meanwhile might be eating chickens, for example. It's still sentient animals which feel pain, and certainly I would say pigs as well, because pigs are very similar to dogs. They have the same sort of feelings. So, but having said that, we at Tract we're against all animal exploitation. So that's why we will equally not just focus on the dog meat trade, we will focus on farm animals as well, because we believe that all animals have an ability to feel pain and shouldn't be constricted. So if you're listening to this and thinking, oh, that dog meat trade is horrible, how can you do that? That's my pet. Then please don't, eat a pork chop, because pigs are just as sentient and just as intelligent as dogs. So to me, that goes back to the whole thing of speciesism. You believe that there's no real hierarchy of animals. So we investigate across the board. We investigate all animals. Yeah,
I think that's a really, really nice and important point to make. Yeah, I heard a few years ago that I'm very interested in birds myself, bird watching, and I mean crows are some of the most intelligent creatures in the world, and I heard that they were doing some research on chickens, which and the initial results were that chickens were incredibly intelligent, and because of these initial results was so much pressure on closing down the campaigns, because the fear was that if people realized how incredibly intelligent and how wide their emotional spectrum is, it would be much more difficult to continue the trade in itself, which kind of builds up under this that we care a lot about animals, which based off of their intelligence, but that also is a way of speciesism, as you say, where we do value some animals based off of something that we are appalled by also within the human species. So we wouldn't give more rights or more we wouldn't give more rights to a person based off of intelligence or appearance, although that sadly happens as well, but it's something that we're fighting hard to end. Yeah.
I mean, that shows part of it. For example, in the UK, birds have protection apart from chickens. I mean, that's a ridiculous thing. They were kind of exempt from some of the initial protections that were regarding for birds, because it all goes back to the agricultural lobbying the government to try and change the legislation.
And you told us that perhaps the most difficult part of your career was when you were working on things and weren't seeing any progress, which after seeing some of the clips, I mean, you spent a lot of your workday seeing appalling things, and then on top of that, seeing no change. I can imagine that must be extremely tough. And in your presentation, you also spoke a bit about not exactly the burnout, but the rate, but that people often don't stay in this for the long term. You've been in this for 4 decades. What has been important for you, for your mental health, for your physical health, to be able to stay in this?
I think one of the things, there's a few reasons. I mean, one of the things I always try and remember is the images that I take are not really mine to keep. And the way I get them out of my head is to share those images, and if those images have an impact, if they have changed the legislation or changed public consumer consumption or awareness, it actually kind of mentally in my own head, they get out there, so actually there's a release. And that sounds quite philosophical, but it's actually, if we have victories, it really lifts the mood. Obviously, well, not obvious, it's obvious, isn't it? If you have victories, it lifts the mood, and therefore you stay more sane. So that's one level of trying to keep sane whilst doing these investigative jobs. But I do follow traditional relaxation. I've been meditating for probably about 5 years. I've been doing yoga for 15 years, and traditional relaxation type things that you would expect. But also one of the things I love to do is play football. That's kind of gets my attention out, and to that end it really helps me. I shout at people. I suddenly became a completely different character than I normally am. It's always good to have a real release.
And you told us a really interesting story about this football team, about also how sport can be a spark for social change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an activist. That's kind of what my heart is. So I kind of have every kind of act I do, it's not, I wouldn't say obviously political, but it's social. So 25 years ago, I set up this football team, and it's called Union Street, and we kind of set it up to disrupt the notion of playing football has to be a real macho type activity. So we decided to join an official league. So I think we're on, if we're registered with the Football Association, and we are on the 9th tier. So if we get promotions 10, 15 times, we might be playing in the football league. But we don't, because we're rubbish. So we're an official football team, but what we try and do is be inclusive, and we try and show that football doesn't have to be macho, it can be inclusive, and we try and play it in a gentlemanly way. We have a motto, we call ourselves love, peace, freedom. I actually sponsor the football team. There's 4 of us that sponsor it, and I have tracks investigations on the back of the football shirt, and we have rainbow colours at the side, and we kind of show that we're an inclusive team. And a couple of years ago, one of our members, he's a doctor for asylum seekers. There's an asylum seeker hotel right in Oxford, and he's the doctor for the asylum seekers. And he was sort of concerned about their mental health, and they had no, because they were cooped up in a hotel often for over a year. And so as a team, we decided to offer training facilities to them. There was a field, a football pitch, and quite run down, and we contacted the council and got it mowed so they could play, and we donated football kits and football and joined them. And I think that's a really important thing. It's not just to donate things, it's actually be playing with people. It's not just oh, here you are, forget about it, or donate something. It's actually having human interaction. Just be with them. It's not actually asking about anything. It's just showing them that it's an act of solidarity by, where there's so much hostility, to asylum seekers. It's to say, okay, it's, we are part of you. We're not going to judge you. We're just going to play football with you. So, even though it's a very social thing, it's also a political thing for me, certainly anyway, because that's how you change society. You don't have to do things with a hammer. You can just play football. And we've helped we organised tournaments, and we played with other teams, and we've invited them to the team. At the moment, we have 2 asylum seekers actually playing for us, signed on and playing every week. So that's kind of a natural integration. So it's not, and we don't really massively advertise this. We just kind of just get on with it, and it's always an honour. They have their own football team, and often they don't have goalkeepers because they all like to score goals and show off their tricks, And so, and I've played in their team for a couple of, in about 3 or 4 games as a goalkeeper, and I really love it. It really feels quite warming, and I don't know why, because it's just an act of, I suppose not an act of kindness, but I just see such gratitude back as well, but not overtly. It's just it's a connection, and I'm not articulating it very well, because there's nothing to articulate apart from a feeling, and it's quite hard to articulate feelings. But yeah, so the football team it's a football team. We play in the regular league, but it's also a tool for social change in a slightly subversive way, I would say. And it's one of my most proud moments, actually, setting up that team 25 years ago. I'm really proud of the investigative work I've done, but I'm also proud that we've set up a football team that is inclusive, and we have all sorts of different people in the team. We're not just what we call liberal lefties in the UK. It's kind of people from working class backgrounds within the city, and we just try and be a bit more inclusive. Of course, we can all do better, but we just try our best.
And I think what you're saying here is so important. That really, what you said, that you try to bring the social aspect into every act you do, and both professionally but also with the football team. I think this really sums up the intention behind Handprints as well, that if we focus on just one issue, our own issue, and we neglect other issues, we end up doing a lot of good within our field, but then we undo the good done by others in other fields because we eat meat, or because we don't act in an inclusive way. We let our unconscious bias take over. So I think this is so beautiful to hear that, and I think it's really the path forwards as well as a society, to be able to lift our gaze and to be able to focus on, have more than one thought in our head at the same time.
We shouldn't be judgmental about people who are different from us, or do different things to us, because we all evolve. For example, I was a meeting, when I grew up in Sri Lanka, for example, I had no affinity with animals. I didn't have pets. I didn't, my only affinity was when I ate them on the plates, And when I moved to England, I was eating meat and not having any affinity. And it's only through reading, education, that I had a different thoughts, and through my work now, I'm hopefully educating other people about a viewpoint, but I don't want to ram it down their throat and say, you must do this. I'm just saying, this is what, when I'm filming factory farming, this is what the reality is, and I'd love you to make a choice that was a compassionate choice and choose kindness, but if you don't want to do that, perhaps you'll do it at a later date. So it's hoping people will change. I'm kind of an optimist, and I think you have to be an optimist and think things can change, because things have changed. Things have changed for the better. So just got to keep pushing at it. And one thing I mentioned in my speech at the end, I think yesterday, was it's a marathon, not a sprint. You're not going to get results, and I think certainly a lot of people, especially younger people, I'm turning 60 now, so next month, so I might get my old wise head, but certainly a lot of people, I think, are looking for quick fixes, and I don't think there are quick fixes. I think, we all want change absolutely now, but the reality is, that doesn't happen. Social justice movements of the past, took ages. Slavery movement, the women's emancipation movement, it took a while, so I think they'll get there, but yeah, it'll take a while.
And how do you see the path forwards?
That's a really interesting question, and normally when people say it's a really interesting question is they don't know the answer. And I don't know the answer. I'm not one of these people, I'm not a real visionary person. I kind of live more in the moment and live more in what can I do now to help things, and obviously, and an ideal place is, I'd like to see a world where there was no suffering, and that's quite utopian for animals and for people, and that would be a vision. But how do we get there? Through small incremental steps, really. It's working. Yeah, and it's working with what you know as well. It's working. I work in the field of animal welfare and animal rights, because I've suddenly got into that field. I've got a niche in that field, but yeah, I haven't got a real good answer for that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think it's also very interesting. You do social justice work within the whole formal context of founding tracks, being the leader of tracks, doing hundreds of investigations, but also on the other spectrum, just being a fellow team player. So you kind of show, I think, the entire spectrum of how you can have a positive impact on the world. How is it similar and how is it different in this really small scale and this much more larger scale context?
Well, my work with tracks is very, very, very focused. It's it's doing the investigations, so organisations can then lobby and campaign for real change, and that's it's a very I call it a professional outlook. Whereas my social aspect is it's political, but it's social. I don't want to make it as a massive political act. It's all political acts don't have to be grandiose. They can be kind of small acts. So whilst I say it's political, I would say it's political with a small p. It's kind of it's just who I am. So anything that I'll do, I'll try and either do it politically and also artistically as well. I think it's really important. That's certainly an area that I'd like to explore as well. It's like you don't have to be an obvious campaigner. You can change people's minds by various ways, and that's something I've done in the past and I'm looking to explore more in the future.
And if you had 1 minute to talk and the message would be broadcasted to absolutely everyone in the whole world, they would be forced to watch, how would you spend that 1 minute? Not that we're forcing you to do that now, but just talking about it.
About 35 years ago, I was on a show by Boy George when I showed my first film. It was called Meathead, and he interviewed me, and he said to me, "What's my message to the people?" And I haven't got a message to the people. And I was stumbling, and I was saying, well, he was saying, shouldn't politicians act? Shouldn't they be the ones to really change things? And at the time I said, well, absolutely, politicians have a role to play, but the individual also has a role to play, because you can change your attitude, you can change what you consume, you can change, you can actually change things, and if enough people change things, the world could be a better place. So I haven't got a minute speech, and perhaps I should be practicing that.
If you had the question twice, then you might have to.
Yeah, but then if you do that, it becomes a manifesto, and I don't really have a manifesto, because it's. I mean, the speech that I gave yesterday was my first ever presentation and giving a talk, so I'm not used to being a public spokesperson, and I've done probably 3 or 4 podcasts, so I haven't done one for about 4 years. So if people ask me, I will say yes, but I don't actively, positively go out to promote the work, because the beauty of Tracks is we have organisations that use our material and they promote the work. So in a way I can pass it on, and hopefully they can change the world with our material.
And to me this is a brilliant example of really specializing within what you're good at, and then through efficient collaboration with others who can then promote the work, then it's a very complementary approach. And I think, the social movement has a lot to learn from this, I think.
I became a specialist in investigations, and I realised that's what Tract is very good at, doing investigations. But I also realised I'm not a specialist campaigner, I'm not a specialist lobbyist, I'm not a specialist media person, I'm certainly not a special social media person. And you need to collaborate. I mean, that's why you change. But for example, the RSPCA, which is the biggest animal organisation in the UK, was set up partly by William Wilberforce, who was a major opponent of anti-slavery. So some of these social justice issues were then intertwined. So there was anti-slavery, vegetarianism, animal welfare, and it was so it's not a new thing to actually realise that you don't have to be a specialist, or you don't have to be just against one thing. History has told us that if you're into social justice issues, it's generally across the board.
Yeah. And we see sometimes a bit of rivalry between the social justice issues, which one is important, but it has a lot in common, as you say, that it is very often about extending compassion, extending humanity, or extending a set of rights beyond the major group that has it at that present moment. And that this happened with slavery, with apartheid, with women's rights, and now it is something that is happening more and more with animal rights. Do you think, this is something I think about sometimes, is this the last struggle with animals, or do you think this is just a struggle of our time, and then after that there will be something more that is beyond our ethical comprehension?
Yes, another good question, but I think I'm often amazed how animal rights is not taken more seriously, And going back to the analogy with going back to my football team, for example, they are generally very progressive people and very, progressive, and are anti-sexist, anti-racist, and things that you've said. But often, a lot of them have a blind spot with animal rights, and I can't quite work it out. And I'm not one to actually ram it down, to actually question them and say, well, why the hell aren't you into animal rights? Because, the beauty of my work is I do this work and then it goes out there, but on a personal level, and going back to your reason of how I keep saying this, I don't live like I'm not an animal rights activist 24/7. So when I go and speak to people, they won't know I'm a vegan. I have the opportunity. I don't see myself as being an individual propagandist because I want to relate to people as people. So, yeah, I'm surprised that they don't see animal rights as a big issue, and I think that's a reflection on the wider world, that animal rights isn't seen as a bigger issue. So, how do we solve that? Is perhaps through things like handprints, to show other people, to show other people in social justice issues that there is a rights issue, and to extend that and to think about it, and at least think about it. I mean, that's how you start creating change, is to have that thought.
We have a closing tradition on the podcast, which is that one guest leaves a challenge for the next one and for the people listening. And the aim of the challenge is to promote some kind of positive impact, either on the person themselves or on those around them or the world. So I wonder, what kind of challenge would you leave for the next person and those listening?
I think it's always easy to do a cooking challenge. So when you go and cook tonight, think about what's on your plate and think compassionately, choose kindness, and then enjoy your meal.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was really wonderful speaking with you. It was insightful, it was inspiring, and it was really, just this energy of compassion and kindness. And
Well, thank you very much for having me on this. And it was circumstance that we sat together next to Melanie Joy's thing about burnout. And thank you very much.
And I will link to your website. I think your speech from yesterday was also recorded. So if that is accessible on YouTube, we'll add that as well, if people want to dive a bit deeper.
Okay.